Bueno, buenos días. Yo soy Ignacio Gasparri, les doy la bienvenida. Estoy acá para ayudar con la moderación de la primera plenaria. Muy cortito, voy a estar tratando de compilar las preguntas que ustedes hagan en el panel. Tengan expectativas por ahí de que haya preguntas explícitas tal cual las escriban ustedes. Vamos a hacer nuestro mejor esfuerzo para sintetizarlas y poder transmitírselas a Justin. Yo no tengo mucho más que decir y la dejo a Priscila.
Bueno, hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la reunión argentina de Ecología. Primero quiero agradecerles a todos por haber seguido apoyando este evento a pesar de este formato tan inusual, pero creo que igual le vamos a sacar provecho a esta nueva forma de encontrarnos. La verdad que estoy muy contenta de presentar a Justin y que Justin esté a cargo de la primera actividad de la RAE. Él nos va a hablar acerca de modelos vinculados a mejorar el pronóstico sobre las respuestas de la biodiversidad al cambio climático. Justin es profesor e investigador de la Universidad de Aberdeen en Escocia. Sus intereses están vinculados a la dinámica de poblaciones en contexto temporal y espacial. Su especialidad son justamente los modelos complejos. Ha dirigido y participado en un montón de proyectos de investigación globales que abarcan distintas partes del mundo. Y bueno, y pueden seguir leyendo seguro sobre su currículum en el link que está acá abajo en la Universidad de Aberdeen, pero lo que tal vez no encuentren allá es que Justin es una excelente persona, una persona súper creativa y curiosa, y creo que eso es lo que le permite también llegar mucho más allá, como expandir las fronteras de la ciencia, que creo que es súper valioso, y por otro lado es una persona muy generosa, que siempre se está preocupando por los demás, y eso ha hecho que forme un excelente grupo, no solamente académico, sino un grupo muy humano. Acá los pueden ver mezclados tucumanos o argentinos con el grupo de Justin de Escocia. La verdad que es gente maravillosa, y creo que esta capacidad de formar redes humanas hace que la ciencia pueda seguir avanzando con bases sólidas. La verdad que lo valoro muchísimo. Y otra cosa muy breve que les puedo decir es que a Justin le encanta Latinoamérica, le gusta mucho Argentina, así que seguramente, ni bien la pandemia lo permita, lo vamos a poder tener de nuevo por aquí para poder hablar en vivo de ciencia, tomar cerveza y conocer lugares muy lindos. Esto es todo para la mini presentación. Justin, it's your turn. Very welcome. You're very welcome. I stop sharing.
Gracias, Pri. I just start sharing my screen, if I find it. Okay, can you see the screen?
Sí.
Perfect,
Yes.
I'm ready to go. Okay, buenos días a todos y todas. Es un honor dar inicio a la reunión argentina de Ecología. So, thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation today. It really is an honor. And I should start first by thanking Pri for her really lovely introduction, very kind introduction. And I want to thank Pri and also Leah Monti really hugely for the opportunity to work with them, to introduce me to the wonderful country that Argentina is, to have a taste of the fantastic people that live in Argentina and the research that goes on in Argentina. The last few years, getting to know more about the country, the people, and the research and opportunities for further research have really been a highlight for me over the last few years. So really thank you very much, Pri, and thank you for this opportunity to tell you something about the work that we do in Aberdeen but also more broadly, where I see some really big opportunities for us as an ecological community to come together as empiricists and theoreticians to really make some serious progress towards improving the fate of biodiversity in the future. So I want to start just with some background, with some figures that are really illustrative of the problems that we're facing in the globe. So I think this here is a really impactful way of showing how climate has changed over the last century. This figure here, this is a stripe graph, as it's called, shows how temperature has warmed really steeply in Argentina, and it's similar patterns for the globe, it's similar patterns for other parts of the globe. Another major change that's facing biodiversity, facing ecological systems, is land use change. So here is how land use has changed from year 0 through to 2016. And you can see here, sort of mirroring the pattern of climate change, that there's been incredibly steep change in land use over the last 50 or 60 years. So massive increases in the proportion of the Earth's surface in the globe that's used as cropland and for grazing, and to a lesser extent, but still significant extent, in built-up areas. In the sea, there's huge exploitation, and again, this has risen incredibly steeply since the 1960s. So the graph on the left here shows how much is harvested from the sea per year, and on the right, how much of that is human food. And there has been some leveling off over the last couple of decades, but the total amount of harvest from the sea is huge, undoubtedly placing major stresses on marine systems. Another stressor on natural systems can be invasive species. So here's a figure that shows for Europe, I haven't managed to find one for the globe, how the number of invasive species recorded in Europe have changed through time. There hasn't been such a steep increase in this since the 60s, but nevertheless, there is continuing increase in the number of invasive species, all of which have the potential to threaten the native ecosystems. So together, we have really strong evidence now that these different stressors are having substantial impacts on different parts of native or natural biodiversity. So across a broad set of taxa, it seems to be true that at least up till now, habitat loss, habitat degradation has been the primary threat to different sets of species. This is as assessed from the Living Planet Index. However, for some species, it isn't habitat loss that's the biggest impact. So especially in marine environments where the previous figure showed just how much harvest there is from the seas, it probably is exploitation that is the biggest impact. You can see climate change appears here, but at least up till now, it hasn't been the primary driver or as a threat to biodiversity. But it's very likely that as climate change accelerates, so the proportion of these bars that ends up being due to climate change is likely to increase. So we have very good evidence of there being major drivers of potential threats to biodiversity, and evidence that these are having impacts on a whole range of different species. And here's estimates of what proportion of species in different groups are at risk of extinction due to those drivers that have added together or in interaction with one another. So estimates of proportions of species that are threatened by this of extinction are really substantial. And many more species that may be not threatened with extinction are likely to have massive reductions in their abundance. So extinction to some extent is really going to be the tip of the iceberg in terms of the overall impact. So that's what's happened up till now, and we have very good projections on what's going to happen in the future in terms of climate. So this is just one of many similar outputs that you can see where complex models incorporating many different processes run on substantial computers project how climate is going to change into the future across the global surface. So these are run for different political, economic future scenarios, assuming different emissions pathways, and are run multiple times because these models themselves are stochastic, and they can then be embedded into future scenario planning, which are used widely now, as you'll know, by politicians in setting some strategies. So we don't just have those forward forecasts or projections for climate systems. Increasingly, over the last decade and a half, we have similar types of projections for how land use, global land use or regional land use, are likely to change in the future, again, for different future scenarios. So the figures here show from year 850 up till around about the present, what the pathway for land use has been across the globe, and then the different slices that you see show alternative future projections according to different scenarios. So again, these types of projections are made by models that incorporate considerable levels of detail in terms of economics, socioeconomics, and increasingly in human behavior, and including things like resistance to change within individual humans. So increasing amount of process are starting to go into these land use models. So just to have a little think about the history of global climate models. So I think really it's been a major success that the global climate model community came together really in the 1960s and quite rapidly became a highly collaborative group of researchers. The work that they've done since then has really had substantial influences and is really now embedded in a lot of global and regional policy development. And the level of organization really reached a very strong level from the early 1980s with the development of the World Climate Research Programme. And that's a global body that helps coordinate efforts to improve models and forecasts for climate. So around the globe, there are several big teams of researchers that build and sort of refine, improve, test, further refine, improve, test, and then apply different models. And they do a lot of intermodal comparison. They learn a lot from each other through often workshops and conferences that this world body, global body, organizes. So they're really very, very enthusiastic collaborators. And together they also develop international standards for climate data, and they propose future areas where there needs to be emphasis to have further model development or to have further priority data collection to improve their ability to make effective forecasts on how climate's going to change at different scales into the future. So what about biodiversity forecasts? So I think currently it's fair to say that we don't have models equivalent to those that the climate community have, and probably not really even equivalent to those that the land use modeling community have for aspects of biodiversity. So it's an interesting history. So I went back and had a look at the history from the same period that the global climate modeling community started to really assemble itself in a serious way, which was in the 60s. And in the 60s, there was actually a very similar initial organization of a set of biologists, mainly ecologists, coming together with a view to build complex computational models and develop ecological systems where they would collect the parameters to inform those models. So it was called the International Biological Programme. It was mainly initially a set of European and Canadian researchers, and then a lot of researchers within the US got involved, and it ended up being heavily funded by the US for a period of probably 6 or 7 years. And you can see from the text down here that they were really thinking in a very different way at the time to what the traditional ecological modeling in that period would have been. So the traditional ecological model in the period would have been highly abstract mathematical models. So it's when people like Robert May were really making a major impact in terms of understanding ecological theory through the use of abstract mathematical models. But here they were talking about synthesizing large amounts of information using computer techniques into working models that can be used for predictive purposes. And they were talking about integrating this with other disciplines like hydrology, meteorology, chemistry, mathematics, soil science, economics. So I think the aims here were laudable, but it never got going. After this initial tranche of funding, the funding stopped and it just fizzled out. So this initial aim to bring communities of peoples together to develop highly process-based predictive models, and this was happening about the same time as the climate modeling community were doing the same thing, it really died a death. And it died a death, I think, for 2 reasons. One was just because some of the challenges faced in this ecological realm were harder challenges to face than in the more physical realm of climate science. But probably, I think, more importantly, it died a death because there were strong opponents to this approach. People that really didn't see this as being a proper scientific endeavor in the way that their more hypothesis-driven science was. And some of the main opponents to this approach were very definitely the more abstract mathematical modelers, who were probably really influential in terms of funding decisions. So since then, we've definitely seen some substantial progress in developing more process-based ecological models also that will include some evolutionary processes, but that's really been very much bottom up compared to the science community. So there's been just small groups of people developing their own models for particular levels of organization. So some will have been developing models for population ecological questions, some for more community ecology, some for more probably ecosystem level questions. But it's really been driven by single principal investigators or maybe 1 or 2 PIs coming together. It's not been coordinated in the way that the climate modeling community has very much been coordinated over the last 40 or 50 years. So in a recent piece of work led by Mark Urban that quite a large group of us have been involved in, we reviewed current models used for making projections for biodiversity and looked at their characteristics. So on the left, you can see the outcome of this review exercise. So the names of all of these models is down the left, and then the key components that are in them, the modeling unit, so that's sort of the level at which they're trying to make projections, which could be about populations, it could be about the occupancy of particular species, it could be about biomass, so a range of different things the projections might be being made upon. And the complexity of the models is also differentiated on the left with the black and the grey. So it's really, the message here is it's a really patchy situation. So we don't have individual models that model all the different processes in a reasonable degree of complexity and can provide outputs at different levels of organization. So we've got models that can make projections, say, on population viability of an individual species, or we've got models that can say something about the likely genetic diversity that there might be within a population in the future, but we don't have anything at the moment that brings things together in an integrated way. And some of these models are also very hard for people to use unless they're really quite a serious computer programmer. So there's an issue also of accessibility. I'm just zooming in here to show some of the models. Some of you will be familiar with one or more of these. There's some really sort of classic ones, things like Vortex in here. There's a group in here that are really, or Ramas. Some of you have heard of Ramas. Steps is a freeware version of Ramas. So a lot of these are population level models. So at Aberdeen, we've developed one of these models. It's a model called RainShifter. Is actually coming to Argentina to give a workshop on RainShifter, where I first met Priscilla, and she traveled down to Bariloche from Tucumán, a very long bus drive, to come down to make the workshop. And I'm very, very, very happy that she did, because it's led to a lot of great contribution, great collaboration since. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now just telling you a little bit about this one model that we've invested very heavily in Aberdeen, in building and now and in applying, to give you a sense for what goes into these models and the types of things that they can do. And then I'm going to sort of step back out again and think a little bit about the future, the challenges in the future for the community of ecologists, that's modelers and empiricists, for how together we can really drive this effort forward to produce more effective models in the future. So this is the paper that introduced RainShifter. It's all the way back now in 2014. So it's an individual-based model. So what that means is that within a computer, we're actually representing many individuals, and those individuals can have different properties associated to them. So an individual will have a bit of information that can tell what its age is, what its sex is. It can carry information about its health status, potentially, about how likely it is to disperse. It can carry some genetic information. So within the computer simulation, using an individual-based model approach, you can build a lot of complexity in to have individuals having different characteristics to one another. The model's spatially explicit. That means that you're representing space, and in representing explicitly, you've got some patches of habitat that are closer to others and further away from different patches. So you can actually incorporate realistic landscapes within the model. So you can have quite abstract landscapes. So there's a landscape over here where you've just got some of the landscape is unsuitable in black, and then some cells are suitable in white. You can represent gradients. So this is represent a gradient where you've got warm patches down at the bottom in the redder colors and cooler patches up at the top. So you can then simulate climate change. Again, this is quite a hypothetical landscape, but you can also incorporate realistic landscapes extracted from GIS, from geographic information systems. Our motivation for building RainShifter was to go beyond classic species distribution models, correlative species distribution models. So there were a whole bunch of papers that came out around 2010 or just afterwards, really making the case that as a community, we needed to go beyond these correlative models. Not that these correlative models weren't useful, they definitely are useful for some things, but they don't enable us to do other important things that we want to do. And I think a key part of that is having models that can help us to determine what types of conservation interventions are likely to be most useful. So Brian Huntley, I think, summarized it well when he wrote that what we really need are a next generation of fully integrated dynamic models that incorporate climate suitability, habitat suitability, population dynamics, and dispersal. So Rainshifter really was an attempt to meet this challenge that had been set by quite a number of people, that we should be moving beyond the climate envelope modeling approach. So our aim was to build a model that would allow us to investigate species ecological and evolutionary responses to environmental changes. And we've applied the model now to do that with quite a number of species, some of them illustrated there at the top. We wanted to be able to actually use the model as a platform for developing new theory on how species should be expected to respond in general to environmental changes. And I think for me, the most important aspect of building it was to really take this theoretical understanding into a space where you could apply it to explore the likely relative effectiveness of alternative management interventions. So there's a case here where we looked at alternative reintroduction schemes for the meadow brown butterfly in Finland. I'm going to tell you more about this example here, where we looked at alternative approaches for improving the functioning of highly fragmented landscapes for forest birds in Africa. And another example actually of an introduction, the Eurasian lynx, which doesn't live currently in the UK. It used to many years ago, hasn't done for a long time, and there are current plans to reintroduce it. And we use the software to look at where the best place might be to introduce the lynx back into the UK, actually into Scotland. So I'm just going to tell you more about the middle one of those examples, which is this African example. I think it's one of the best two or three cases we've had where we've worked with people who have very, very good data on a particular system to use that together with the software that we've developed to inform conservation planning. So Job Arben led this work. You'll see a picture of him working in the field in a moment. So the aims of his work were to quantify the movement behavior of this particular species here, the Cabanis greenbull, in relation to the highly fragmented African landscape he was working in. He wanted to validate a model of connectivity of how the bird moved between different patches using empirical data he'd collected on both the movement of the animals and on gene flow between patches. And then with that, with a well-validated model for movement and demographic model, he wanted to build some spatially explicit models to inform conservation planning. So this is the area where he was working. This is the Eastern Arc mountain range in East Africa. It's a real biodiversity hotspot. High proportion of species there are endemics. He was working right at the northern part of that mountain chain in the Taita Hills in southern Kenya. So it's just zooming into the Taita Hills. This is the Taita Hills, and it was heavily forested, but now almost all of the forest is gone. So these are the forest patches that are left. So there's been huge habitat loss and fragmentation. This is what it looks like. It's some forest patches which are mainly left now up on the peaks, up on the peaks like here. And then the intervening matrix, the non-habitat, is quite small holdings with low intensity agriculture and quite a lot of trees there still, which maybe do support some movement. A lot of the tree species, the trees that are there are actually not native species though. The bird species itself is a forest-dependent insectivore. It's thought to be pretty sensitive to fragmentation, and it doesn't actually currently occur in all of the patches on the landscape. So Job and colleagues in southern Kenya wanted to collect movement data. That was the main thing that was lacking in order to be able to understand how this species might respond to different interventions. So they did some translocation experiments. They caught 28 green balls from within their habitat patches, and they displaced them to matrix, non-habitat, some distance away, and they radio tracked them as they moved back towards their habitat patches. And during the time that they were tracking the birds, 27 of the 28 did relocate their initial habitat. So these are the types of tracks that they obtained. So here a bird was released at the yellow point, and the way they move is they tend to move from one perch, then they fly to another perch, stay there for a bit, move to another perch. So each black dot on here is where they've landed for a little while on a perch, and they've got another GPS location. So it's a step-by-step movement trajectory. So this was actually really fantastic data for building a model for how the birds relocate their habitat patches when they've been displaced from them. So the way we did that, in short, was to simulate many tracks of sort of simulated birds behaving according to different rule sets. And the heat map here shows, for one rule set, simulated rule set, a heat map of how often the simulated individuals would be in different cells on the landscape. So you can imagine we then run that for many different rule sets, and you get different types of heat map coming out. And we can overlay the actual tracks. So here's one actual track, and we can get a statistic that says how well does our simulated rule set match the actual tracks. And through that, we can identify the best combinations of parameters for the movement model that give us the best match to the real data. So we did that, and that then should be a good model for how the displaced birds, adult birds, relocate their habitat patches. I was actually really pretty skeptical that although we might build a good model for that process, that would necessarily be a good representation of how very likely juvenile birds disperse from one habitat patch to another habitat patch. So you can imagine the motivations could be quite different. An adult bird displaced from its own habitat patch is probably going to be pretty scared, and it's just trying to get its way home as fast as possible. A juvenile bird that's probably going to be the disperser, when it leaves its habitat patch, it's probably motivated at that point to be a disperser, to go out into the wide world and to find another habitat patch. And it also doesn't know where it's going to, because it's probably not seen the wider world at that point. So I wasn't at all convinced that this was going to be a good model for dispersal. Thankfully, we had some genetic data from adult green balls in different habitat patches, and we could build a model that related the genetic matrix, genetic isolation by distance patterns from the different habitat patches, to a matrix of how many dispersers you were likely to get from one habitat patch to another habitat patch. This is something that people have done quite a lot to look at the comparisons between models where you're looking to see if least cost path models of movement are better than Euclidean distance models of movement. So the Mantel correlation is a relationship between your modeled movements of individuals between different patches and what the genetics tell you there are likely to have been movements between different patches. And the dots on here show what the model built using the data derived here provided, compared to what we would get with Euclidean distance, least cost path distance, or another model of movement, which is derived from a graph theoretic method called circuitscape. And the really reassuring thing here is incorporating all these extra details in the movement model, parameterized from the birds returning to their habitat patches does a better job than the other methods. So now, armed with this parameterized and validated model of how birds disperse between patches and very good demographic data that have been collected over the previous 10 to 15 years by Belgian researchers in Africa, we wanted to look at how spatial planning options would influence the likely future dynamics of the bird in the region. So these here are the current fragments of patches in the region. And from stakeholder workshops, a number of realistic options were derived to improve the landscape. You could restore habitat, you could enrich the matrix, you could provide some corridors by improving the matrix in a very focused way, or you could do some conversion of exotic plantations into indigenous forest. So there were 4 different areas where there was exotic forest, and that could be restored to indigenous. Then there was also one large area of a similar total size to the 4 smaller ones. So we used range shifter with the demographic model, the movement model, and with the landscape maps and management scenarios to do the projections to see what the likely fate of the species would be with the different alternatives. And these were the outcomes. So to cut a long story short, in the long run, converting the large exotic plantation would be the best thing to do of these options, if you could only do one, in terms of improving the population size of the species. In a short term, doing some restoration of existing patches to increase the local carrying capacity could have greater short-term benefits, but that's not sustained over the long term. And for this particular species, in terms of the overall population size, actually improving connectivity has only marginal impact. So these are the examples down here. Only marginal impact, if any, really, of improving matrix. However, one of the things you can do with this now spatially realistic model is just drill down a little bit deeper to see what's going on in different patches. And that can be really informative. So just to show you quickly, one of the outcomes we got from this type of model that you wouldn't be able to get from models like Vortex, for instance, is we could look at some of the patches where we actually see that some of the interventions reduce the population size. So now we're looking here on these graphs here, they show for individual patches compared to the baseline, which is do nothing, the dotted line, how the different interventions impact population size. So for FU and ND, they're these 2 bits, 2 patches here, the existing patches. There's a substantial reduction in population size, and it turns out that is when we actually return some of these coniferous plantations into habitat. So this was puzzling to start with. Why is it that when we put a new habitat patch close to these small existing patches, we see a reduction in population size? So classic metapopulation theory would tell us that these patches should then do better. What it turns out to be is that individuals from these strong patches, this is a strong demographic unit here, so individuals that disperse from there heading in this direction that used to go to these patches here now end up being very likely to first see this patch and go to this patch rather than these ones. So effectively, this patch here casts a shadow over these ones in terms of dispersers moving from this patch. And because it's a small patch, it doesn't produce itself enough dispersers to these patches to replace those that it takes from the patch in the south. So this is something that's been highlighted in very theoretical models, the potential for this shading effect. But here we see it in a model which is really set up to look at more complex real systems and be used for application. So I think a message here would have been, if it had been possible to put a patch, new habitat, not here, didn't expect that to come up, not here, but over here to the right or over here to the left, it would probably be more effective because you'd be less likely to be stealing dispersers. So I just want to really finish a bit now by talking about challenges in achieving more general use of this type of process-based model, and to think a bit about how we're going to do that. Also think a little bit about what types of forecasts are most useful. So just briefly on the bottom one first, I'm not convinced that we're really going to be in a position over the coming decade to make reliable forecasts on exactly where individual species are likely to be, say in 50 years from now or 100 years from now under climate change. So for individual species, I think it is so complex and there's so much stochasticity involved that that is probably a very challenging prediction to make with any reliability. However, I think these types of process-based models can be extremely useful in terms of comparing and contrasting sets of alternative management options. So we can make forecasts on how well different management options are likely to protect the viability of individual species, or what proportion of species different management options might be able to protect. Or similarly, if we're trying to control species, how effectively will management options control or eradicate invasive species? So when we're trying to obtain funding to develop these models further, as people were probably getting similar criticisms in the 60s, we still often run into criticisms that quite large parts of the ecological community take the view, and I think it's a very legitimate view, that these models are almost too hard to parameterize for it to be a useful exercise. So this is just one anonymous review we got on a recent grant proposal, where they say the approach of the modeling framework, in this case we were wanting to build species interactions into range shifter, seems to be build it and the data will come. Yet the modeling framework seems to be considerably outpacing parameterization ability. And then they conclude with it's a little bit of a depressing thing to see when you've spent all the time on proposal. They conclude by suggesting that it ends up becoming a pseudoscientific endeavor. But I can take the point. There is a huge challenge with gaining the data that we really need to parameterize these models if we're going to run them for multiple species. So we do have some methods already that we can start to use that. I'm just going to quickly flag one here. So it's possible to take something called a trait-based approach. So there is, across many, many different species, we have good data, but for very few species do we have data on lots of different aspects of biology. But in taking a traits-based approach, you can look for correlations between traits that exist when you make comparisons across many, many species. Here we did it for terrestrial mammals. And then with this information, you can create lots of virtual species with plausible combinations of traits that you can then run through the models. Another thing you can do with this traits-based approach is to impute missing values for species that you might want to make predictions for. So taking this trait-based approach, we were able to run range shifter and estimate what proportion of mammal species, terrestrial mammal species, would have rates of geographic spread that would enable them to keep pace with climate velocity. So climate velocity is how fast you'd need to keep moving year on year from where you currently are to keep experiencing the same climate as you currently do. And when we ran these models, we found that about a third of species, 28.6% of species, are likely to have rates of spread that are lower than climate velocities. And in these models, it was really a potential climate velocity because there was no habitat fragmentation. It was just looking to see across continuous suitable habitat how fast these mammal species would be likely to move. So I think there are clever ways in which we can use existing data to do better than we currently do. But I think more than that, we need to, again, look to what the climate modeling community did. So the climate modeling community from the 60s till the late 80s, they were building better and better models. But then the IPCC in 1990 really recognized that in the climate modeling world, they probably had the issue that's highlighted by the reviewer there, that the models are outpacing the data. And they identified the need for more systematic long-term observations of the system. And they emphasized the need for these data to be used for parameterizing key processes for models and for verifying model simulations. And based on this recommendation, the Global Climate Observing Society, or Global Climate Observing System, was set up in 1992. Here's a picture of the first meeting, and that's become a really important part of the climate modeling community. And the data are well integrated, they're freely available, and they link very, very tightly to model parameterization and model validation. And we really need, I think, now similar strategic ecological data collection in order to really progress modeling efforts. Briefly now, I just want to flag that biological systems don't exist in a vacuum. We need our projections of ecological systems to integrate with things like land use systems. That's something we've started to do recently at Aberdeen, is to dynamically couple our models with models that land use modelers have been working on. When we do this coupling, we can find that the projections made from uncoupled models can be substantially different to those that we make in coupled models. What I've talked about so far today has really all been on a terrestrial world. So Rainshifter is basically a model for the terrestrial world. The things that are strong in Rainshifter are its representation of demography and dispersal. And Rebecca Elguy, who you see a picture of here, she's just completing a PhD where she's taken the principles of Rainshifter into the marine world. So now it's a 3D landscape, you have 3D movement of organisms and population dynamics. And it's going to provide a platform that will really integrate the complex movement, active and passive movement of individuals within the marine environment with their population dynamics, so that we can ask similar questions in marine environment to those that we've been doing in the terrestrial environment. We really need, a major challenge is to bring together different components of ecology more effectively. So in Rainshifter, we've had dispersal and demography, but we don't have yet interactions. We have very limited evolution. We have no physiology. There are other tools that are being developed that have, for instance, physiology and evolution, but don't really have dispersal and demography, and various other combinations. So again, going back to here, there are different models that have different factors considered within them, but we don't have models that really consider everything. So again, in this sort of working group that we have, we've been thinking hard about what the ideal modeling framework would look like if we could come together as a community to build it and it was properly resourced. And it would look like a modular model where we could plug in dispersal, demography, morphology, physiology, phenology. It would have genetics in it. It would link to human impacts, the ability to test different management options. It would certainly be multi-species, having species interactions. And ideally, it would be sort of a modular model where people could plug and play different aspects of the model depending upon the data availability and depending upon their needs. So that's where we'd like to get to. Ideally, with such a model, so this is the ecological model, we can eventually have it wrapped up within an adaptive management system that would also take advantage of the artificial intelligence methods that are being developed very, very fast by people like Google. I've got a PhD student, Alice Scarpa, who's working in the group. She's a mathematician by training, and she's currently working on trying to apply the methods that Google have used to come up with AIs that can beat the best humans at games like chess and Go, to use that to come up with optimal strategies for managing invasive species. So I think there's huge potential to use AI alongside the development of process-based models for improved management. If I had to sort of highlight one word that I thought we need to do much better within the ecological community, if we're going to make the progress that the climate community have done, is to be better at collaboration. So I think that's absolutely key, and that's key at different levels. It's key for field workers, field ecologists to collaborate, and across realms, across terrestrial ecology, across marine ecology. They need to collaborate with modelers. And amongst modelers, we've got different communities that aren't always seeing eye to eye. We've got the mathematical modelers, we've got the computer modelers, we've got the people that really focus on the statistics. They need to collaborate together more. They need to collaborate well with the field ecologists. So this probably represents most of you who are here for this conference. You fit somewhere within this space. But we as a community also need to do more to collaborate with other academics. So we need to collaborate with social scientists, with climatologists, with hydrologists, etc. Also, and probably even more challengingly, we need to work together with stakeholders, key stakeholders. So these can be farmers, it can be sort of the money men, the people involved with industry. We need to work with politicians. And I think there's a space here for, in the way that you can imagine, the climate models have almost produced some sort of shared space which all of these groups interact with in one way or another. In the climate world, the empiricists, the modelers, people from other academic disciplines, and different forms of stakeholders all have interactions with these models and their outputs. Ideally, we'd have the same thing eventually in ecology. But if we're going to get there, it does require us to work much more collaboratively with one another than we often do. I'm just going to end by highlighting that if you want any more information on Rainshifter, here's the website. I'd really hoped that I'd have been able to be in Tucumán with one or two of my group to run a Rainshifter workshop following this meeting. Very sad that wasn't possible, but as soon as the COVID situation allows us to travel, we will do another Rainshifter workshop in Argentina, and it would be fantastic to meet some of you at it. And thanks to Pri's quick Spanish lessons, I'm going to try and finish with a few Spanish words. So apologies to my awful Spanish accents, but muchas gracias por su atención. Espero que disfruten del congreso. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The talk was great, and I think that it's very inspiring to start this meeting. One question is related with a simple practical thing. What is the meaning of the sign of Facebook and Twitter crosses?
So that sign there just means that for those particular screens, preferably it would be good if it wasn't shared, because that's currently under review. So ideally it wouldn't be publicized just yet, but no huge problem as it has been.
Thank you. And another question says that despite of the delay of the development of the biodiversity models, they are developing quite fast, isn't it? And sorry, do you think that niche models will be nowadays? Oh, sorry, they are adding some questions. Ignacio, could you read it? Yeah.
Is it related to what's the future for niche models?
Yeah, it's related to niche models.
Yes, so I'm definitely not in the camp of people that don't believe niche models aren't useful. I think where we are at the moment, if we were to do away with niche models, we'd need to have process-based models that could effectively describe the functional relationships between environmental variables, including climate and habitat, and the vital rates, so rates of density-dependent reproduction and survival. And that's so challenging to get that I think at the moment, if we're trying to project where species might be in the future, then a hybrid approach where we take a niche-based modeling approach to define the environmental space that's suitable for a species, that's then coupled with at least the demography and the dispersal that you can get in something like range shifter, maybe some evolutionary processes, is going to be the best way to go. I think ultimately, if we could define those functional relationships between the demographic rates and the environmental variables, then I think if we got to that stage, eventually niche models would be obsolete, but we're miles away from that at the moment.
Okay. Another question says that if a range shifter can be applied to an entire community, taking into account temporal land use change, and also if it could be linked with economic change that drives these land use changes.
So in terms of the land use change, yes, definitely. So we've just released actually Range Shifter 2. So if you go to the website, you'll find that it's just been accepted for publication in ecography, but it's already up on bioRxiv and the model's there. And you can read in as frequently as you want. So it could be every year, it could be every 10 years, you can read in a new land use. And that land use could come out of a land use model, or you could try some alternative scenarios that you just developed yourself. So land use, definitely. We can also dynamically couple range shifter with the land use model, because sometimes range shifter will be producing outputs that can be treated in terms of natural capital that might influence how human agents respond to managing the land. What we haven't got in range shifter yet is the community side. So we're desperately trying to get funding for that. That'll be a huge job, but we keep, well, 2 or 3 times now, we've come up against people who are really skeptical about this type of modeling endeavor. So far we haven't had the resources to build the community side into it, but we will do one day.
Great. Well, we are just in time to finish this session. Thank you so much, Justin, to all the talk and your patience to be here in some way in Argentina.
So thank you very much, Pri. Thank you, everybody. And I really hope you have a wonderful conference.
Thank you so much. Bye.